They had buried an empty box and called it Mercy. For 7 winters, the hall above Drakemore kept her name from every ledger and every prayer, and the boundary stones beyond the gate burned cold and silver to keep whatever might wear her face from crossing home again. The pack that once knelt to her now told its children a different story, of a Luna who had betrayed her king and paid the only price treachery allowed. On the night the wards finally thinned, when the old rite came due again under a moon-stripped bare of cloud, something walked out of the dark wood toward the vigil stones. It did not walk alone. 2 smaller shapes kept pace at its sides, hoods drawn low against the cold, and when the gale dropped and the silver fire along the stones guttered low enough to see through, the watchman on the wall swore later that the dead woman's eyes had found the keep and held it, steady, the way a queen looks at a debt long owed. By morning, the whole of Drakemore would know her name again. What no one yet knew was what the king would give up to speak it aloud. If you have ever waited 7 years for the truth to be believed, you already know what it costs to keep walking toward a door that once shut on you. Stay a moment longer. She was about to learn whether Drakemore remembered her as a traitor or as something the wards themselves could not hold. 7 years before, in the deep cold of the year 1444, on the night the pack called the Veiling, Wren had been Luna of Drakemore for less than 2 winters when the council declared her dead. The charge was treachery. A letter bearing her seal, found in the regent's hand at the worst possible hour, claimed she had traded the keep's grain stores and its gate codes to the Greywater pack across the river. She had never written it. She had never even learned to forge her own name as neatly as the letter had forged it for her. None of that mattered once Lord Edrin Voss carried the page into the great hall and set it before a king half mad with a different grief, his father dead a fortnight, the throne not yet settled under him. Bracken had not looked at her once during the reading. She remembered that more than the verdict itself, the way his jaw had gone to stone and stayed there while the council voted to invoke the oldest law the pack kept, the veiling rite, which did not kill a woman so much as erase her, sealing the guilty beyond the vigil stones and striking every record of her from the world inside them. A mercy, they had called it. No blade, no body, no grave to tend or to curse. Only a door that shut and did not open again. She had been carrying his children when it closed. For 3 days she walked the frozen wood beyond the wards, not knowing whether she carried them at all, until an old herb woman named Senna found her half frozen under a fallen pine, and took her in without asking what crime a sealed woman could have committed worth more than a roof in winter. Senna had delivered the twins in a hunting shelter with nothing but boiled snow and her own steady hands, and had stayed 7 years after because, she said once, she had never had much use for a king's law, and even less for his court's idea of guilt. Finn and Leora were 7 now, sharp-eyed and quiet in the way children raised at the edge of a curse learn to be quiet. They knew their mother had once worn a crown. They did not know until tonight that the crown still existed, or that the wards keeping them out had a single night a year when the old fire ran thin enough to cross. Wren had not meant to come back at all. She had told herself that for 7 winters, the way a person tells herself a great many things to keep walking forward through snow. The mark on the inside of her wrist, the same silver ash that the veiling had burned into her skin the night they sealed her, had begun to itch 3 days past, a slow heat under old scar tissue that meant only one thing in the lore Senna had taught her. The wards were thinning. They would not thin again for another 7 years, and Finn had started asking, in the careful voice of a boy who already understood not to ask twice, whether his father was a story or a man. So she had come. Not for the throne, not even, she told herself, for the king who had let a forged letter decide what kind of grief he was allowed to feel. She had come because her children deserved one true look at the place they came from before she decided, finally, whether to let them grow up believing it had never wanted them. The vigil stones stood at the tree line exactly as she remembered them. 6 gray shapes taller than a man, ringed in silver fire that crawled along their faces like something alive and starving. Senna's hand found her shoulder. Leora's small fingers found her sleeve. "You are certain?" Senna said. Not really a question. Wren was not certain of anything except that the fire along the stones burned the same cold color it had burned the night they put her on the other side of it, and that her wrist had begun to ache in time with her own heartbeat. She tightened her grip on each child's hand, one on either side of her, and stepped toward the gap in the silver flame where the old wood path still ran straight and dark into Drakemore. The fire did not stop her. It went through her instead. A single white line of pain from wrist to shoulder that buckled her knees and stole the breath clean out of her chest, and somewhere behind her she heard Senna's sharp intake of air and Leora's small, frightened sound, quickly swallowed. She did not let go of either hand. For a long moment after the fire passed through her, she could not feel her own feet beneath her, only the cold biting up through her boots, and the children's hands gripped tight in hers, real and warm and present in a way that steadied her faster than anything else could have. Senna's voice reached her as if from underwater, murmuring some old herbwoman's remedy against shock. And slowly the world resolved itself back into snow and dark trees, and the lit shape of a keep she had once called home. The pain did not leave her once she had crossed. It settled instead into a slow, simmering line beneath her sleeve, the silver ash mark visible now even through wool, faint and white as frost. 3 figures crossing the dark beneath the vigil stones at Veiling Moonrise was not a sight Drakemore's watch had been trained for in 7 years of quiet. The horn sounded before Wren had gone 20 paces past the tree line, and torches bloomed along the palisade like a second, angrier moon rising. She kept the children behind her without breaking stride. Senna kept pace at her back, one hand on the strap of the satchel she had carried, unopened, every year of their exile. The patrol that reached them first was young enough that none of the guards had served the keep when she still wore the crown, and she watched their faces do the particular work of trying to reconcile a ghost story with a living woman standing calm in the snow. Torchlight threw their shadows long and shaking across the drifts, and somewhere behind them a dog began barking at the open gate, unsettled by something in the air it could not name. One of them, braver or more foolish than the rest, planted himself squarely in her path, blocking the way forward with his whole body. "Name yourself," he said, "or be put back through the stones the hard way." "I do not need to name myself," Wren said. "Name the law you think you are keeping, and then go and wake the man who wrote it." It was not courage, exactly. It was simply that she had spent 7 years too tired and too far from help to bother pretending to be smaller than she was, and the habit had not left her at the door. Word of a wraith at the vigil stones reached the keep faster than any guard could run, and Lady Esme Rourke arrived at the gate wrapped in furs over her council robes, her face already arranged into the particular contempt she had been cultivating for 7 years toward the memory of a dead Luna she had hoped to quietly replace. "It speaks now, does it?" Esme said, looking Wren over the way a woman looks at mud tracked across clean stone. "A wraith Luna with a tongue. Lord Voss will want to see this trick before it spreads to frighten the children of the keep." Behind Esme's shoulder, Finn went very still at the word children, his small hand tightening in Wren's. Leora did not look away from Esme's face, and something in the girl's steadiness made the noblewoman's mouth thin out, as though she had expected fear and found something less convenient instead. It was the captain of the gate guard who broke the standoff, a broad-scarred man Wren did not recognize until he spoke her old title without thinking, the word catching in his throat the moment he heard himself say it. "My queen," Aldrich said, and then, recovering, more carefully, "the council will need to be woken regardless. Bring her in under guard. The children, too. Gently." No one had ordered gentleness. Esme's eyes cut toward him, sharp and assessing, but Aldrich had already turned to organize the escort himself, his back very straight, his voice pitched for duty rather than memory, and if his hands trembled faintly arranging the children's cloaks against the cold, no one in that yard was positioned to call it anything but care for prisoners who happened to be young. They walked her up through the lower bailey she had once crossed every morning without a guard at her elbow, past the kennels and the well and the long, low stable block, all of it unchanged in the particular way that made 7 years feel suddenly, dizzyingly short. The keep rose ahead of her exactly as it had the night they took the crown from her hair, gray stone going up into torchlit dark, and somewhere above the gate a bell had begun to ring the household awake. She did not look for him in the windows. She told herself she did not look. She looked anyway, and found nothing but firelight and shadow where a man might have been standing, and could not tell whether the ache in her chest was disappointment or relief. They brought her to the small audience chamber off the great hall, rather than the dungeon, which she understood later was Aldrich's doing, and not mercy from anyone above him. The room smelled of old smoke and beeswax, familiar in a way that ached, the same tapestries she remembered still hanging faded against the stone. The children were seated on a bench near the hearth under guard that did not quite manage to look like guard, and Senna stood close enough to keep a hand on each small shoulder. Lord Edrin Voss arrived before the king did, robes thrown on hastily over a nightshirt, his gray hair uncombed and his face already arranged for judgment. 7 years of regency had carved deeper lines around his mouth than Wren remembered, the look of a man who had grown comfortable speaking for a throne he did not sit on. "The veiling does not fail," Voss said, before anyone had asked him a question. "It has never failed. Whatever crossed those stones tonight is not the woman it wears the face of, and I will not have Drakemore's council frightened into believing otherwise by a trick of moonlight and old grief." "Then test it," Wren said. "You have the right. You have the stones. If I am not who I say I am, sealing me again costs you nothing." Something moved behind Voss's eyes, quick and gone, and she understood in that instant that he had not expected her to offer the test herself. A guilty woman would have begged for mercy. She had offered him the blade instead, and watched him recalculate. It was the serving girl's stumble that gave the chamber something to look at besides accusation, her armful of wood tipping toward the hearth fire as her foot caught the uneven flagstone. Wren crossed the room before she had decided to move, catching the girl's elbow and hauling them both clear of the spilling logs, the edge of one catching her own forearm hard enough to leave a mark. She did not pause long enough to notice. Leora watched the whole exchange with the fierce, cataloging attention of a child memorizing exactly which adults moved first when something went wrong, and said nothing at all, which Wren would only understand the weight of much later. "She is 7, Wren said to the room at large, to Voss, to anyone, her voice not quite steady. "She has done nothing tonight but watch grown men argue about whether her mother is real. Remember that when you write your account of tonight." It was in the doorway, unannounced, that Brecon finally appeared, and the chamber went still around him the way a room goes still around weather. Wren felt him before she saw him, the old recognition arriving in her chest like a struck bell, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth and everything to do with 7 years of trying to forget the exact shape of a man's presence in a room. She made herself turn slowly, Leora still close at her side, and met eyes she had spent 7 winters telling herself she remembered wrong. She had not remembered wrong. She had only forgotten how much grief could age a face that had once looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a turning world. For Brecon it was worse. A single unguarded breath stolen clean out of him at the sight of her. Alive, upright, a child standing close to her shoulder with his own gray eyes set into her small face, and for the length of that breath, every careful wall he had built across 7 years of mourning, a corpse simply ceased to exist. He recovered before anyone but Wren could have named what had slipped. "Lord Voss," he said, his voice gone flat and formal, "you will not invoke the veiling again tonight." "My king, the law is plain on this. A sealed soul that crosses back. It must be answered. The danger weighed before it spreads." "I said not tonight." Brecon did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "There will be a council in 3 days, as the law also requires, and judgment will be rendered in the Great Hall before the full assembly, as is the right of any accused. Until then, she is held, under guard, unharmed." Voss's jaw tightened, but 7 years of practicing authority he did not technically own had taught him when a king's stillness was the kind that did not bend twice in one night. He inclined his head a fraction too shallow to be true respect and withdrew. Esme trailing him out with one last unreadable look thrown back at the hearth. They gave her a chamber in the old guest wing rather than a cell, which she understood as another quiet mercy spent without anyone's name attached to it. The children slept in the adjoining room with Senna between them and the door, and for the first time in 7 years, Wren lay down somewhere with stone walls thick enough to keep the cold fully out, and found she could not sleep at all. He came near midnight, alone, no guard announcing him, and stood in her doorway the way a man stands at the edge of something he is not certain he has permission to enter. "I should not be here," Brecon said. "You are the king. I do not think anyone would stop you." "That is not what I meant." She knew what he meant. She sat up against the headboard and did not invite him in, and did not tell him to leave either, and after a long moment he crossed the threshold anyway, and stood near the cold hearth with his hands loose at his sides, as though he did not trust them closer to her than that. The silence between them had weight to it. The particular charged stillness of two people who had once known exactly how to fill a room with each other and now did not know where to begin again. She watched the firelight move across the scar through his eyebrow, new since the last time she had studied his face, and wondered what had put it there in 7 years she had not been allowed to witness. She remembered, unbidden, the last ordinary morning they had shared before the letter, his hand on the small of her back at a kitchen hearth. Not unlike this one, neither of them yet knowing how little time was left to take such mornings for granted. "I did not write that letter," she said finally, "because someone had to say the plain thing first." "I know. You knew that night too. I watched you not look at me while they read it." "I know that as well." His voice had gone rough at the edges, the formal flatness from the audience chamber stripped away now that there was no one left to perform for. "I have had 7 years to learn the exact shape of what I let happen. You do not need to teach me the lesson again." She had not meant to reach for him. Her hand moved before the rest of her had decided anything, crossing the small distance between the bed and where he stood, fingers stopping just short of his sleeve, hovering there in the firelight, while her pulse climbed loud enough to hear in her own ears. He looked down at her hand as though it might vanish if he breathed wrong. When he finally closed the last inch of distance and let her fingers settle against his forearm, the contact ran through her like the boundary fire had, a different kind of burn entirely, warm instead of searing, and she heard his breath catch audibly in the quiet room. "I dreamed of this," he said, low, almost to himself. "Every winter. I told myself it was only grief making a ghost to torment me with." "It is still only a hand on your arm," she said, because the rest of what she felt was too large to put a careful shape around yet, and some part of her was still braced for the door to shut on her again, the moment she trusted it open. "It is not only that, and you know it is not." She did know. The wanting had never actually died in either of them, only gone quiet and cold the way a banked fire goes quiet. And standing this close to it again, she could feel exactly how little ash had actually formed over 7 years of trying to bury it properly. His free hand came up, slow enough that she could have stopped it, and settled along her jaw with a care that made her chest ache worse than the boundary fire had. Neither of them closed the last distance. They stood instead at the very edge of it, her hand on his arm and his hand against her face, and her pulse loud enough to fill the whole quiet room, both of them aware, without either saying it, that whatever came after this moment could not be unmade once it began, not with a council in 3 days deciding whether she would be allowed to stay inside the wards at all. He stepped back first. 3 days, he said, as though reminding himself of a fact rather than her. I will not let it be undone again. Whatever the council decides, I am done pretending I buried the right thing 7 years ago. It was not the confession either of them had almost made. It would have to hold her until he was ready to say the rest of it where the whole hall could hear. Some doors, once they crack open again, are harder to shut than the people on either side expect. Keep that in mind as the council gathers in 3 days, because Drakemoor's regent has not yet planned for a king who refuses to bury the truth twice. The 3 days passed slower than any 7 years had. Wren spent them in the guest chamber with the children, watched over by guards who would not meet her eyes and fed better than she had eaten in exile, which felt its own kind of cruelty, comfort offered with one hand, while judgment was prepared with the other. In the evening, Senna taught Finn and Leora a counting game with smooth river stones to keep their small hands busy and their minds away from the door, and more than once Wren caught herself watching them laugh at something as simple as a stone clattering off the hearthstone, struck by how strange it was that joy could still find room enough to exist inside a chamber waiting on a verdict. The mark on her wrist had not faded as she expected it might, now that she stood inside the wards rather than crossing them. Instead, it had begun, slowly, to creep, a thin white line working up past her elbow by the second day. And by the morning of the council, she could feel it like a low fever under her skin whenever she held either child too long. Senna examined it by candlelight on the second night, her herb-woman's hands gentle and her face carefully blank, in the way Wren had learned to read as worse than worry. The veiling does not like being walked back through twice, Senna said. Once to seal you out, once to let you stay. The old rite was built to choose one or the other, not both. What happens if it finishes choosing for me? Senna did not answer that, which was answer enough. The great hall on the morning of the council was fuller than Wren had ever seen it, every bench along the walls crowded with lesser lords and their captains, word of a returned wraith, Luna having traveled faster through Drakemoor than any horn could ring it. Bracken sat the high seat with a stillness that gave away nothing to anyone who had not stood close enough to feel his pulse jump under her palm 3 nights running. And Voss stood at the floor's center with a folded parchment held like a weapon he had been sharpening for 7 years. The accused returned across the wards on veiling night, Voss said, addressing the hall rather than the king, claiming innocence of the very treachery the council itself confirmed 7 years past. I present again the letter that condemned her, recovered from her own writing desk the night the Greywater grain theft was discovered, sealed with her own ring. He held the parchment high enough for the nearest benches to see the dark wax seal pressed into its corner, and a murmur ran the length of the hall. A forged seal presses the same as a true one, Wren said, before anyone gave her leave to speak. I do not deny the wax, I deny the hand. Esme rose from her place near the council's front bench, her voice pitched to Carrie. Convenient that the Wraith Luna denies only what cannot be tested 7 years late. Convenient, too, that she brings 2 children to soften a hall too sentimental to look past a small face and see the treachery sitting calmly behind it. The label landed exactly where Esme intended it to land, and Wren watched several of the older lords shift uncomfortably on their benches, unwilling to be the ones who looked too closely at children and called them props. My daughter sat through this entire ordeal without one word of complaint, Wren said. If that is treachery's new shape, I confess I do not recognize the craft anymore. It earned her nothing but Voss's narrowed eyes and a fresh murmur she could not read the temper of. He let the parchment fall closed with a sound like a verdict already settled. "The veiling does not undo itself for sentiment," Voss said. "The law is plain. A soul sealed by the right who crosses back must be judged before the next moonrise or sealed again by the right's own hand, permanently this time, the half measure of a temporary hold having no precedent in 700 years of pack law. Moonrise falls tomorrow night. I move the council vote now, while the matter is fresh, and the danger to Drakemoor's children plain to every lord in this hall." Braken's hand had gone white-knuckled on the arm of the high seat, the only crack in his stillness Wren could see from the floor, but the council's older members were already murmuring agreement. 7 years of grief and law, and Voss's careful regency having built exactly the kind of room that wanted a clean, fast answer more than a true one. The vote came before sunset. By the law's narrow letter, even a king could not overrule it alone. They came for her at dusk the following day, an hour before the moon was due to clear the eastern ridge, and it was Esme who walked at the front of the small procession sent to escort her down to the vigil stones, her face arranged into something almost like satisfaction. "Did you truly believe a hall full of frightened old men would choose a wraith's word over 7 years of settled grief?" Esme said, low enough that only Wren could hear it. "You should have stayed wherever the wards put you. At least there you were only dead. Here you are dead and humiliated both, and your children will grow up knowing which." Wren did not answer her. She had learned, across 7 years and 1 burning crossing, exactly which battles were worth the breath. They allowed her a final hour with the children in the guest chamber before the procession formed, and it was the cruelest mercy of the whole ordeal, watching Finn try to be brave in the careful, too-old way he had learned from watching his mother do the same thing his whole short life, and Leora refusing outright to let go of Wren's sleeve until Senna gently pried her fingers free. "I will not let them take the children past the stones with you," Senna said quietly, while a guard waited at the door pretending not to listen. "Whatever happens to you tonight, they stay inside the wards. I will see to it myself, even if it costs me the satchel I have kept sealed for 7 years. What is in the satchel, Senna? The truth, if anyone in that hall still wants it badly enough to look." Senna's jaw was set in a way Wren had only seen once before, the night she pulled a half-frozen pregnant stranger out of a snowbank and decided the law did not apply to her own conscience. "I kept a copy of the letter you actually wrote that night, the one Voss's letter was built to replace. I tried to bring it before this council more than once in the early years. They called a herb woman's word superstition and sent me home. I did not think I would ever need it again. I was wrong." There was no time to ask why Senna had waited, no time for anything but the guard's hand on the door and the procession waiting beyond it. The walk down to the vigil stones under a rising moon felt longer than the walk into Drakemoor had felt 3 nights before. Frost cracked underfoot in the silence between drumbeats from somewhere up near the gate, slow and ceremonial, the sound of a hall preparing to watch something it had already decided to forget by morning. The whole hall seemed to have emptied out behind her, lords and commons both lining the path with torches, and somewhere in the crowd, Wren caught one glimpse of Finn's small white face pressed against Senna's side before a turn in the path took them from view. Senna's arm kept firmly around both children, well back from the gathering crowd at the stones. Voss stood waiting at the stones themselves, the silver fire along their faces already climbing higher than Wren remembered it climbing, fed, she understood now, by Voss's own preparations through the long afternoon. Braken stood apart from him, flanked by guards who would not meet his eyes, his stillness gone brittle at the edges in a way that frightened her more than the fire did. "The rite requires the sealed soul to stand within the ring at the rise of the moon," Voss said, his voice carrying easily over the gathered hall. "What crosses out the other side, should anything cross at all, will not carry the danger this hall has tolerated for 3 days past. The mark on her wrist had reached her shoulder by then, a low, constant burn she had stopped trying to hide, and standing at the edge of the silver ring, she understood with sudden, complete clarity what Senna had not said aloud in the guest chamber. The rite had never finished choosing 3 nights ago. It had only paused. Whatever crossed back through tonight, sealed a second time, would not be coming back out again at all. The moon cleared the ridge. The fire along the stones surged upward, white and hungry, and Voss lifted his hand to give the order that would finish what a forged letter had started 7 years before. It was Finn's voice that broke the moment before Voss's hand fell, a boy's voice gone high and furious, carrying clean across the clearing from where Senna stood with both children well behind the gathered crowd, shouting that he was not letting them take his mother twice. Ren turned, every instinct pulling toward him, and saw Senna pushing forward through the startled lords with the satchel held open in one fist. The children kept safely at her back the entire way. "I have proof," Senna called, shouldering past benches of lesser lords more from their shock than from any deference shown her. "Proof Lord Voss has kept buried 7 years, dismissing my word every time I tried to bring it before this council." She thrust a folded page toward the nearest bench of lords, ink faded but legible. Ren's own true hand laid plainly beside the forged seal Voss had presented. The two so visibly different in the slant of every letter that even a half-blind elder near the front gasped audibly. Voss's composure cracked for the first time since Ren had returned. A forgery of her own, produced conveniently. 7 years late, one of the elder lords cut in, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had finally been given permission to doubt aloud what he had quietly doubted all along. "Because you made certain, my Lord Regent, that no one who might have doubted you was ever in the room to be asked." The fire along the stones had not stopped climbing. Ren felt the mark reach her collarbone, a heat that made the edges of her vision swim, and understood she had perhaps a handful of breaths left to decide anything at all. She made the only choice that had ever truly been hers to make. She stepped fully into the ring rather than away from it, not to surrender, but to draw the rite's hungry fire fully onto herself and away from any question of who else it might be hungry enough to reach. "If this finishes me," Ren said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, her voice steadier than she felt, "let it finish only me. The children carry his blood, not my crime. Whatever you decide I am, decide it without ever weighing them in it." It was the costliest thing she had ever offered freely, and she offered it without waiting to be asked. The Great Hall's old side doors, sealed shut for the council's procession, tore open behind the gathered crowd with a sound like the keep itself taking a breath, and Brakon came through them at a dead run, his guard fallen away entirely behind him, every careful king's stillness burned off in the space of 3 strides. He did not slow at the ring's edge the way law and 7 years of caution should have made him slow. He crossed straight into the silver fire after her, close enough that the flame guttered and split around the two of them as though it could not decide, at the last, which truth it had actually been built to keep. For a single breath, the whole hall went utterly silent, lords and guards and commons alike caught between the climbing fire and the king standing inside it with a woman the law had named a wraith for 7 years. "I did not bury you," Brakon said, his voice breaking the silence low and rough and meant for the whole assembly to hear. "I buried their lie, and I have spent 7 years standing on the grave of it pretending I could not feel how wrong the ground sat under my feet." It was the line the whole hall had waited the length of one king's mourning to hear, unelaborated, unrepeatable, landing into the silence like a struck bell. He took her hand in front of all of them, scar against scar, and the silver fire along the vigil stones did not surge again. It guttered, hesitated, and then folded inward on itself like a held breath finally released, the right's old hunger finding nothing left in either of them to claim. 7 winters he had ruled Drakemore with an empty seat beside the throne and a hall that had learned not to ask why. Now nearly 200 lords and commons across that same hall sank slowly to one knee, not at any order given, but at the particular weight of watching a king choose, in full view of the law that had failed her, the woman it had failed. Voss did not kneel. He turned instead toward the tree line, fast enough that 2 guards had to catch him before he reached it. And it was Aldrich, of all the gathered men, who bound the regent's wrists with the same cold iron Voss had once ordered fitted to a falsely accused queen. "The veiling does not undo itself for sentiment," Bacon said, echoing Voss's own words back across the clearing fire with a weight the regent had never managed to put into them. "But it answers true blood plainly enough, and yours has never once been hers to question." They sealed Edrin Voss beyond the vigil stones, before the moon had fully cleared the ridge, the same fire he had stoked all afternoon closing around him instead. No blade required, no body left for anyone to mourn or to curse. Esme was stripped of her council seat by sunrise and given a single night to leave Drakemore's lands before the wards thinned for anyone fool enough to walk her back through them. The hall that had once watched her erased in silence now would not stop sinking to its knees, and Wren, standing inside fire that had finally remembered whose side she had always been on, found she did not have it in her to ask any of them to rise just yet. It took the better part of a season to put Drakemore's law back into the shape it should have always held, the council rewritten plank by plank to require more than one regent's word before a soul could be sealed by right again. Wren stood beside Bacon through every hard session of it. Luna, in fact, now, as well as in old memory, and the 200 lords who had knelt that first night in the firelight learned quickly enough that her tongue had not softened any during 7 years of exile. Finn and Leora grew loud and unguarded in a way that took most of a year to fully settle into them, the particular wariness of children raised at a curse's edge, thinning slowly the longer no one in the keep treated them as anything but a king's trueborn heirs. Aldrich taught them both to ride before the first thaw, and by midsummer Finn could be heard most evenings arguing with the stable boys about whose pony was faster, a small, ordinary noise Wren had once feared she would never hear inside these walls at all. Senna kept her herb stores in the same tower room she had once kept them hidden, the satchel finally empty of secrets and put away for good on a high shelf where it gathered nothing more dangerous than dust. The council had taken, quietly and without any official decree, to calling it the night the veiling finally finished its work honestly. Wren preferred Senna's plainer accounting of it, given once over tea in the tower room with the herb stores drying overhead. The rite had never been built to keep a true thing out forever. It had only ever been as strong as the lie someone propped against it. In the deep winter that followed, on the anniversary of the night the wards had thinned enough to let her cross, Wren walked out to the vigil stones one last time, Braken's hand warm in hers, and the children running ahead through fresh snow with Senna's old gray wolf bounding at their heels. The stones stood quiet under their cap of white, the silver fire that had burned along their faces for 7 years gone entirely, banked down to nothing more than cold gray rock, the way any ordinary boundary marker ought to look. Wren turned her wrist over in the pale winter light and found the mark there had finally faded too. The old white scar settled into something faint and crescent-shaped, more a memory now than a mark. Bracon's thumb traced the shape of it once, gently, the way a man touches a thing he had once been certain he would never be allowed to touch again. "They will tell this story wrong for 100 years, he said, a dead Luna walking back through the wards. They will leave out how loud the children were." "Let them leave it out," Wren said. "We will be the ones who remember it correctly." Behind them, Far up the snow-covered path, the great hall's windows had begun to catch the last low light of evening, warm gold against the falling dark, and somewhere inside it a hearth was already lit and waiting for 4 people and 1 old wolf to come back in out of the cold.